That's right, Chase. Keep it low key.
Hello, I'm AD Burrows, and this is another video for annextonothing.com. So recently, a game in which I helped create some of the art for called Lego City Undercover came out for the Wii U. Now during the development, I turned to the free and open source 3D creation software Blender to help me several times with the art, and so I wanted to really just take this opportunity right now to just point out some of the reasons why. Now at the studio, the artists predominantly use Maya, and so the first reason that I'm going to go over here to do with why I turned to Blender is for the Inset Tool. If we can just take a quick look at this image of a scene that features later on in the game, we can see some of the paneling here has a kind of a green bracket or frame to it. To get this kind of geometry cleanly was going to require an Inset Tool. Now it may well be possible that there was an inset script out there somewhere that had this functionality for Maya, but after searching and asking around, nothing came up, at least for me anyway. This is not an issue, by the way, in the latest version of Maya, the Maya 2013, which is the latest version that I'm aware of at least, but in Maya 2011, which is what I was using at the time, that didn't really have a fully working inset. Incidentally, it's tucked away as an offset value, by the way, of the extrude tool. And while it did work, as you might hope, in some simple circumstances where all the selected faces happen to be facing the same way. So if we just grab this cube over here, for example, and just assume that I'm in, well, just pretend that I'm in Maya. If I was to just subdivide these, just grab these three faces and just inset them. If I just come over here, just switch that to the inset. And then if we were to have done that with the offset tool from the extrude in Maya, this is exactly what we'd get. We get this nice sort of even thickness all the way along, and that's exactly what we want. But if we were to actually try and create some kind of inset for some faces which were not all facing the same direction, in fact they were separated by this 90-degree corner as they are on this cube here, and we wanted to inset. So if I just press I to inset again, that's the kind of thing that we're looking to try and do. But if we were to actually just press extrude and kind of scale in, that's kind of the more the behavior that you might get, which is not the end of the world, but it was going to need to have some cleanup at the end of it. It's not exactly how that would have looked in Maya, by the way. It would have been slightly better than that, but nevertheless, it would still need some cleanup after the action, which might be particularly tedious if you've got a lot of work to do. But anyway, let's take this shape, which is the shape that I was dealing with when I realized that I was probably going to need an inset tool with a little bit more function to it, because these obviously aren't all facing the same direction. So if I just press I to inset, as you can see, it's basically as simple as that. And again, just grab these faces here, press I to inset. And then again, it's all fairly straightforward. I'm just going to press E to extrude these in a little bit, like, in fact, let me just do that over here. E and then extrude in. I apologize, my mouse isn't on a very stable surface, which is why I was getting a few problems there as well. And then finally, just grab these few faces, and then what I'm going to do for these is slightly different, because if I was to press E to extrude and then sort of move them down, that might be fine, but if I just switch to a side kind of a view, you can see it's actually bending down. You can see how this edge here is coming down. Now I don't really want that. I wanted it to go straight on, so I'm just going to undo that. Press E to extrude and then just click to cancel that straight away, but we can still see we've got our extruded faces. Can you see the dots there, the zero-sized faces that are just tucked between there. Now what I'm going to do is use the shrink fatten tool, which is basically just a kind of an extrude along a normal, well, move along a normal type of a tool. So I'm going to use that with the Alt-S key. Press Alt-S and then just move the cursor in slightly. Oops, I've forgotten to highlight that face as well. So E to extrude and then Alt-S, just bring that in slightly. And that's it. So that's basically all we needed to do. I then actually went in and sort of beveled some edges and things like that, but that's not important right now. As I say, it is possible to do in the latest version of Maya, but with a application which kind of has a dedicated tool for it. You might find you've got some extra functionality. So for example, we can select the outer or the inner, we can change depth, we can do a few other things here. We can also actually just completely change it to an outset. instead of an inset, so you can get some interesting results there. So the faces that you had selected are perfectly preserved, and it will sort of just push an extra evenly spaced band of faces out around it. And so that's it really. That's just the first thing that I was turning to Blender for to help me with some of the art on Lego City. Next thing I'd like to point out is the Solidify Modifier. Now I should warn that this isn't exactly the glamorous side of game art creation, as it's just to do with optimizing and bug fixing really, but in particular I'm just referring to working with a particular shadow casting prop. So here we have this tunnel, and now let's assume this is a copy of the render mesh, which has had loads of polygons stripped out of it, so it's just really the bare bones of the tunnel shape. And now what we're going to do is we're going to use this streamlined version as basically a shadow caster, so it's much less processor intensive for all the dynamic lights or whatever the issue might be. But the bug is, after we've done so, the object still doesn't seem to be casting shadows. So what we might be unaware of is the fact that when the light up here is casting down, it's not taking these back faces into consideration, and so it's just hitting the ground down here and just making everything look like it's daylight inside the tunnel. So let's say we're not unaware of the documentation, we've only just got on the project or something along these sorts of lines, and basically we were unaware that this needs to be flipped around the other way. Now the problem might be that when you flip it around the other way, you might get some artifacts, some Z fighting with the kind of shadows, and because they're sat in exactly the same position, but now the faces are pointing the opposite way. So what we might like to do, that is particularly tricky to achieve in Maya, because the closest thing that you can really do with that is kind of maybe flip the faces and then kind of extrude out, possibly. But as I say, the issue with that might be the fact that you've still got these faces which are sat in exactly the same location as the original mesh. So you might get some Z fighting, as I say. So that's where the Solidify modifier comes in handy in Blender. So we just, again, grab an OBJ, stick it in Blender. We've got our, under the spanner icon of the properties window, we've got all our modifiers. We can just click on the pull down menu there. We can see under the generate section, we've got Solidify. It's all alphabetically listed. You can see Solidify down there. I've already actually applied one down. So all I need to do is just switch on the visibility icon to see it in the viewport. And we can see we've got this extra mesh, which is basically added. Now that could be not too dissimilar to having extruded along the normals and basically just get that extra bit of geometry there. But the thing with this is that we can just sort of fine tune it, especially if we're bug fixing, just to try and get exactly what the right setting might be, where we get it as close as possible to the render mesh, but not so that it's Z fighting. So we can kind of keep on tweaking these values. And as you can see, we can just offset it ever so slightly, and it can change the this outer shell as well as the inner shell, the original shell that we had. Now also the other thing to point out is that this can go beyond its constraints there. We can actually take that to -2 if we wanted, or whatever the case may be. But as I say, there's these other options. In fact, there might even be more options. I believe they've been working on this recently again anyway. So there's even more opportunity to sort of tweak what needs to be done there. So that's really just a very, very quick thing, not very glamorous, as I say, possibly not even that interesting. But in any case, that's just another thing that I turned to Blender to help me with generating some of the bits and pieces that I needed to perform for Lego City. Something else Blender is pretty useful for is its access to modifiers. Now this might not be a particularly interesting point to make for anyone coming from, say, 3ds Max, where modifiers are pretty fundamental, but in Maya you work with nodes in the channel box rather than modifiers, so it's kind of a different workflow. So how Blender's modifiers helped me was during the early process of creating some of the rocks in some of the areas of the game, I dabbled with a procedural method of creating the high resolution shapes of the rocks and then baking normals from those down to sort of a low res version. This is in anticipation of needing to potentially create quite a few, and this way all the rocks could be basically quickly generated and share the same overall feel. So if we take a look at this image from the farm area, we can see several instances of a single rock asset that was entirely created in Blender from the basic modeled form all the way to 3D painting it. Actually, in the end, I think we had to reduce the textures, so some of the details are lost, but the basic idea still works. So if we look in Blender, I've recreated the basic principle behind the generation of a procedural rock here. But this is a kind of a much more complicated form than the version that we were just looking at in the game, but that really is just sort of to indicate how we can get quite interesting results from very basic mesh modeling, really. So let's just take a look at how this was procedurally generated. If I actually just shift click on this next layer, we can kind of get a kind of an ascent of man, but a kind of the ascent of rock, if you will. But if we actually just take a look at this first image, this is the wireframe of the mesh. This is basically what that other prop that we were just looking at is derived from. And if we come over to the modifiers tab within the properties window, we can see these are all the modifiers that combine to create the end result, but we can see that they're all basically switched off right now. None of these are enabled. But if we move over to the next one, we should be able to see that this first subdivision surface modifier, where it's been subdivided 4 times. If we actually just switch it into wireframe there with the Z key, you can see basically it's just smoothed that form up quite a lot to give us the amount of geometry that we need to essentially just create our first set of displacement, which is this, the mid-detail form. Now with this one, this is where it starts to look a little bit more genuinely like a rock of some kind. And this mid-detail form, this modifier is just found within the deform section, and you can see displaced there. Once you put this on, you just get this section here. And really the 2 main things are we've got our mid-level and the strength, and now I've just sort of played with those 2 settings. I think these 2 are on, the texture coordinates may have been global, but I've just switched that to local, but otherwise the direction is normal, and I think that's the correct by default anyway. The real key here is the texture that is deriving it. So at the moment we've got this mid-detail. If we just come over to the texture panel, this isn't actually being used on the material at all. This is just to show the texture in this sort of preview window here, but otherwise we're not actually using it in any other context than to generate this form. So if we just switch back to that and just see this mid-detail again, basically that's what the texture looks like. It's a Voronoi type. If we actually just click on this pull down menu, you can see all the various different procedural textures that we can create there. There's some non-procedural textures options in here, for example, that these images, but the others, we can sort of choose from any of these to generate our displacements. And for this one, I've just gone for this Voronoi type of effect. Now, the only thing in here is I've just sort of switched the brightness and contrast ever so slightly, not very much, but the key thing is the fact that the feature weights just usually has this 1 on. I've just cranked these all up to 2. And that kind of generates this kind of an idea. And if we just move to the next one now, we get this sort of these cracks. Now, what's happening here, if we just come back to the modifiers tab, we've got another level of subdivision, which is 2 more subdivisions. So we've got even more geometry to play with now to just really get some nice smooth cracks. And that's basically what's happening again. Same sort of idea, another displace modifier. Texture is called cracks this time. So if we just switch this over just to see what that looks like, which is not very detailed right now, but basically it's a very, very large Musgrave procedural texture. If we just take a look here, I'm actually using a ramp this time. And what I've done is just increased the contrast by just dragging the black side up to about nearly 1/3 in. We can see it's a linear interpolation between the black and the white. And if we just come down a little bit further, we can see that it's heteroterrain and Voronoi crackle that is at play there. And it's just very set to a very large size. And that just gives us the large cracks that we get there. In fact, I've actually played with the offset slightly as well, just to refine that type of crack a little bit further. The next thing that we can see here, if we just move over to the next detail, the next level of detail is to do with these, what I've just called pox, which is just sort of these sort of flattened areas, these sort of carved out areas that you can see here. Now what this texture looks like, same thing again, displace modifier, driven by a texture, which is this pox texture here, which is a distorted noise type this time. This means that we can use overlay 2 different types of noise. So we've got the first noise is the Voronoi, and then the basis of that is this purling noise. Basically, I've just cranked up these settings really, really high. So we've got a lot of distortion, and that distortion is very, very large. And the other thing to note is that the ramp is on again, but we've flipped it this time. So instead of it going from black to white, it's going from white to black. and again I've increased the contrast, and I've actually just added some extra markers along this black to white gradient just to try and increase the contrast in a very specific area as well. Otherwise the settings are fairly standard. And then finally I think we're at the end conclusion then, which is just this sort of fine detail noise that we can see. If we just come back to the modifiers again, we've got this fine detail, again another displacement modifier, just set to mid-level 0.5, very low strength, called fine detail. If we just go back over to this to just preview this here, fine detail, we can see clouds texture. On here it's really simple. I've just upped the contrast ever so slightly, just switched it from soft to hard, and then I think I've increased the standard size up a little bit more. But otherwise that basically will generate this kind of form from this kind of input. Now just to show you some other examples, if I actually just come over to here, I've actually just got exactly the same modifiers and exactly the same textures, all the same settings, exactly the same. It's just that this is a slightly different shape. If I just tab into edit mode just to see what kind of shape that is, that's all there is to it again. And then, as I say, we've got this other rocky-like form that seems fairly reasonable, certainly to bake some normals out of. And then otherwise, we've got this other example, which is basically just a slightly stretched out and rectangular cube. So we can see that that's the kind of result that we would get there. But all we would need to do is tab into edit mode, grab a face, we could extrude that out a little bit more. And then we don't really get much of an update until we tab back out to object mode to see what that's done. And it's basically just stretched out, as you would imagine. I'm just going to go Control R, add an extra edge loop down the center there. And then let's just see what effect that's having. And now we're getting sort of more of a kind of a slab kind of a look. But if we actually come over now, maybe grab these two faces, just extrude those out slightly along the normal, and just take a look at that now. We can see we're starting to get some more of an interesting shape, and really basically that's just the workflow. Really kind of come in here and then see what kind of shapes that you might enjoy to use, and then we can tab back again, and then we can see just from very basic input we get some nice rocky shapes. None of the procedural information will be stretched or anything. It's just tweak it however we see fit. And that's basically it. Once we do that, we want to create a low resolution version and then bake those details on. So I thought it might be a good idea to conclude this first part by just drawing attention to some of the add-ons within Blender that deal with this sort of creation automatically. This isn't something that I've used within the creation of Lego City as such, but I just thought it might be a useful addendum to just make note of here. In any case, all we need to do is just navigate up to our user preferences, and then we can see under the Add-ons tab, we've got all these filters on the left-hand side. Just make sure all supported levels are enabled, and then under the categories, just come down to Add Mesh. And then we can see all the available default objects that we can generate in the 3D view in just a moment. But the two I want to specifically make note of is the landscape and the rock generator. On the right hand side here, just make sure these are enabled. Incidentally, there are other very useful objects that I definitely encourage you to have a look at if you haven't rummaged around in here before. Things like the bolt factory. That's very cool, and the pipe joints and things like that could be very useful to either bake out basic elements of to Z depth and get height maps and normal maps from, or maybe you could use them in your mesh details as well. But in any case, they're very handy. And also, just as an aside, an add curve, we've got our ivy generator and sapling, which is basically our tree add-on, tree generator. They're very cool as well, but they're under the curve settings. So once we close this window and then go Shift A and then go Add Mesh, we've got access to, for example, under the curves, there's our ivy and tree that we just mentioned. Or under the mesh at the bottom here, you can see with these little plug icons, all our add-ons. And as we've got there, we've got our rock generator. So all we need to do is just click on that, and then we get our first rock in the scene. Now basically what we've been doing manually, it is just set up automatically for us. We can see we've got our subdivision surface objects there, as well as all the displacement modifiers, plus all these procedural textures have been included. And we've even got a material set, as you can see there, because we've got generate materials enabled at the moment, and we get a little preview window of that material there as well. Incidentally, what's happening down here is it's using a random seed, but we can take that off and then run through various different variations of these settings. But otherwise, we've got these presets. This is set to asteroid at the moment. In fact, that should probably say asteroid, I think, rather than asteroid, but I might be wrong there. But we've got other options like sandstone. So if we just take a look at that, that's quite cool. We get these kind of striations to it. And then also we can try the something like a river rock, for example, which is going to be quite a smooth mesh. We can get better detail by just cranking up these this information over here, the detail level. We can increase the amount of geometry that's being used. The main settings of this is the number of the rocks. I'm just going to keep it to 1. It's just going to place this kind of interlocking rocks just to create a little bit more of a convoluted and complicated structure that you might like. But otherwise, we've just got the scale for the X direction. I think this is in Blender units, as well as the Y direction and the Z direction. And we've got our general deformations that are taking place here, and then materials, and that's pretty much it. We can also just go to the default setting, and then we've got access to just create our own there. The downside to this is the fact that if we go into tab into edit mode and then start trying to create different overall underlying mesh structure for which to generate all this procedurally information on top of, we're going to lose access to this potentially more user intuitive interface on the left here. But having said that, we're still going to get access to all these settings on the right. That's not going to go anywhere, but just bear in mind that if you start trying to do things like move around, if you do any operation, you're going to lose this most recent information tool operation information that we get over here on the left hand side. So that's just something to be aware of. But in any case, let's just delete that. Just take a very, very quick look at the landscape as well. And then once we create this, we'll see again, we should be able to get access to all the more user intuitive interface over here. We've got access to some presets, and we've also got access to be able to switch this to a sphere if we want to make more of it just a rock or a boulder. So I'm just going to click on that now just to see what sort of settings we get there. And then just, as I say, just have a rummage around these settings. I didn't want to go into this very, very much. I really just wanted to just point out that these things do exist. But otherwise, that's just all I wanted to wrap up with right now. As I say, I didn't actually use these methods within the creation of Lego City, but I just wanted to point out that they're there. And that's it. So that's all for now. I hope some of this has been informative and maybe even useful. And thanks for watching.